Visiting with us, that's the text that we'll be looking at, Romans chapter 2 in particular. And we want to get to that in just a few minutes. There's several things I wanted to make comments on about what we've done thus far. And one of is that our memory verses, hope you will keep remembering the theme of the book of Romans 1:16 through 17. For I am not ashamed of what? The gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation to everyone who believes, Jew first, also to the Greek, for therein is the righteousness of God revealed. From faith to faith, the just shall live by faith. Now what's Romans chapter 2, verse 11? Our second chapter, we're trying to pick a verse out of each chapter that will have some significance to the chapter, and try to remember that verse as well. What is 2:11? There is no respect of persons with God. That's King James. The New King James is there no partiality with God, whichever way you want to remember that. Very important part of chapter 2. And we were looking at that last week, and that particular aspect of God. Part 3, as you see on the screen, no respect of persons with God. Today we will get into the law and judgment. Our text will be from verses 12 through 19. But before we get there, we want to get to some things that we where we stopped last week. We didn't quite finish up with verses 1 through 11 of chapter 2. So I want to go back there and pick up where we left off. Now, one of the places we had gotten to, and if you remember in chapter 2, verse 1, he makes a statement, "You are inexcusable, O man, whoever you are who judge, for with whatever way you're judging, you are condemning yourselves, because you are committing the same things that you are judging or condemning others for doing." And so, since some were condemning others, they're doing the same things, Paul actually raises two questions. And these questions require an answer. And the first question was, do you think you will escape the judgment of God? Now, in effect, what he's saying, since you are judging others, and you're doing the same things, is that because you think you're not going to be in judgment? That's why he asked that question. Why would they might think that they would not be under the judgment of God? And he's specifically talking to who? Jew or Gentile? To the Jews. So why would the Jews possibly come to the conclusion that they could escape the judgment of God?
Abraham's father,
They're in the covenant relationship with God, the nation of Israel, God's chosen people. They may have concluded that we're not under the judgment of God because of our relationship to God, descendants of Abraham, the promise that was made that through Abraham would be blessed. And so maybe that's the conclusion that they reach, and therefore they could pass judgment on others even if they were doing some of the same things. But then he says, maybe that's something else. Or do you despise the riches of his goodness, forbearance, and long-suffering, not knowing that the goodness of God leads you to repentance? Do you despise? What does that mean? We talked about it last week. Do you disregard or think lightly about the riches of God's goodness, and not knowing that is the very thing that leads you to repentance? So those are the possibilities that Paul raises as to why they were doing this, committing sins and then judging others for doing them. And so that's where we were last week. Now, we didn't get to this point, and I think it's very important from verse 5. If you want to look there in verse 5, he says, in accordance with your hardness and your impenitent heart, you are treasuring up for yourself wrath in the day of wrath and revelation of the righteous judgment of God. So what characteristics of the heart result in this storing up or this treasuring up of wrath? And you see on the screen, it's almost like you're just stacking up wrath. Now that's a pretty hard thought to think about it, isn't it? That you're just piling up to yourself the wrath of God. You're adding to various levels of the wrath of God. I don't want any part of the wrath of God, do you? And he says you are, but what you're doing is you're storing up wrath. So what part of the heart or what characteristic of the heart does he say that's causing this to happen? Your hardness and your impenitent heart. Those are the specific things he said. Violation of the law is certainly true, but he makes this statement, your hardness and your impenitent heart. or the English Standard Version says, and if someone has it, you can correct me, but I think it said, because of your hard and impenitent heart, because of that heart, you are treasuring up or storing up for yourself wrath. So it's because of this kind of a heart that you have that is creating this position you are in with piling up the wrath of God or storing it up. Now, you know Proverbs 4, verse 23, what does it say? Keep thy heart with what? All diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. But there's another passage that's similar. Can you think of something in the Sermon on the Mount that's similar to this aspect of treasuring up? Lay not what? Lay not up for yourself treasures on earth, where moth and rust corrupt and where thieves break through and steal. But in contrast to that, you should lay up for yourself treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust corrupt, nor thieves break through and steal. For what? For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. So you see it, he's talking about in the same kind of an idea here, your heart, if it becomes hard and impenitent, you're treasuring up for yourself wrath. But if you keep your heart with diligence and do the things that where you're laying up treasures in heaven, that indicates that where your treasure is, there is where your heart is also. So you see the similarities using these various words and ideas to help us see what's taking place. And I just absolutely love the way Paul ties all this in to the theme of the letter. The gospel is God's power to salvation. And in this context here, we're talking about the need for the gospel. Everybody needs the gospel. And part of why you need it is because you develop this hard heart, impenitent heart. You're piling up wrath for yourself. Now, there's another way to look at this. What is it that causes a hard heart? And you said it, Larry. What causes a hard heart? Is it obedience? No, it's disobedience. Disobedience is what causes the hard heart. Now, a good way to illustrate this is, how was Pharaoh's heart hardened? There's three ways that it was hardened. You mean when in Exodus chapter 7 and the following chapters where the plagues were coming upon the children of Israel, and Pharaoh would say, okay, I'll let y'all go, and then he would harden his heart? Or what else happened? Who else hardened his heart? Did God harden his heart? The text says in 2 or 3 different places where the plagues were that he was going to let them go, but God hardened his heart. What about the magicians? The magicians, whenever they were doing some of the same by trickery, things that the miracles that were done by Moses and Aaron, they were deceiving Pharaoh, and the Bible says that the magicians were hardening his heart. So you have actually 3 different things that were happening to Pharaoh's heart. Pharaoh hardened his own heart. It said that Pharaoh hardened his heart, God hardened his heart, and the magicians hardened his heart. How did God harden his heart? Is it something that Pharaoh had no control over, and God just did something to him that he could not have any response to it all, that Pharaoh had to have a hard heart because God did it to him? But what was it that God did that gave him a hard heart?
God presented decisions. God put Pharaoh in a position to make a decision.
Good, that's good.
And we confront decisions every day, and how we make those decisions. And where we seek counsel, we look to God's Word to help us make decisions. We can make the right decision. But anytime we make decisions that affects us, either for good or for bad, God presented Pharaoh with decisions. Pharaoh had to decide whether he would let the people go or he would not.
Okay, he gave him a commandment through Moses, and he rejected that. He disobeyed. When God gives us a commandment and we disobey it, it has the effect of hardening our heart. It's just like if years you listen to the gospel and you reject it and you reject it and reject it, your heart gets harder and harder and harder. And indirectly, What God is telling you to do is hardening your heart because you're rejecting it. And it has that effect. So a hard heart is brought about by disobedience. When you disobey God over and over and over again, creates this problem. Now here's what he says, how this progresses. Disobedience, or you remember he says, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and righteousness of men who do what? Suppress the truth in unrighteousness. When you suppress the truth in unrighteousness, or it's the same as disobedience, when you disobey God, there's something that happens. You get a hard heart. When you get a hard heart, what happens after that? You're piling up wrath. And you see how this is connected with everybody needs the gospel, because when this happens, when you disobey God, you're getting more and more subject to the wrath of God. And that's why he says, after he makes the statement about what the gospel is, power of God unto salvation, he goes on in verse 18 to say, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all these things. That is what's happening. And so he's further going into this, how it progresses, how it develops here in chapter 2. Now, how is God's judgment? Now, this is what is happening. How is God's judgment described? It's a righteous judgment. God is completely fair in judging everyone and anyone. In his wrath being distributed, being poured out, it's a righteous thing. It's justice. And you think, well, I think it's totally unfair for God to do this to this person or that person. They didn't know, or they didn't this or that. God's judgment is righteous no matter what he does. His right, and that's in our study this morning, we're going to get into both law and judgment. That's what we're looking at here in the latter parts of chapter 2. But what does he say? He will render to each one what? According to his deeds. Now you keep this in mind. There's a lot of opinion out there that we're not going to be judged on our works. That we're going to be, and all these things here in this part of Romans are explaining things about law and judgment, so that when Paul gets to discussing grace, love of God, we can understand that that doesn't mean that our deeds, how we live, have nothing to do with how we will stand before God in judgment. We'll say more about that as we come to it. But he's making the point, no matter who you are, you're going to be judged according to your deeds. And he says in these verses, and we read these last week, I'm not going to read them again, I'll just put some on the screen. Eternal life will be rendered to those who by patient continuance in doing good seek for glory, honor, and immortality. Those who seek these things, patient continuance in doing the right things, making the right decision, there's eternal life. But for those who are seeking self-seeking and obey unrighteousness, he has these strong warnings. Those who obey unrighteousness, what they can expect is indignation and wrath, tribulation and anguish on every soul that does evil, the Jew first and also to the Greek. Now notice that, Jew first and also to the Greek. He says about those who do what is good. Glory, honor, and peace to everyone who works what is good, Jew first and also to the Greek. So he's making the point about the fact that this includes everyone. Whether you're in a covenant relationship with God as the Jews were, or whether you are a Greek who is alienated from the commonwealth of Israel, he's making these points to them that everyone is going to be subject to the judgment of God. There is no respect of persons with God. That's a key point, chapter 2, verse 11. Now, what does this tell us about God's judgment? And I just mentioned it. There's no partiality with God. God's fair in his judgment. He has a righteous judgment. Now, let's get to any questions or comments about this section of Romans. Let's move on to what he talks about in verses 12 through 29. And we haven't read these verses, so we'll go ahead and read these to familiarize ourselves with what we're talking about here, beginning at verse 12. For as many as have sinned without law will also perish without law. And as many as have sinned in the law will be judged by the law. Now notice how many times the word law occurs in these verses. For not the hearers of the law are just in the sight of God, but the doers of the law will be justified. For when the Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do the things in the law, these, although not having the law, are a law to themselves, who show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and between themselves their thoughts accusing or else excusing them, in the day when God will judge the secrets of men by Jesus Christ, according to my gospel. Indeed, you are called a Jew, and rest on the law, and make your boast in God, and know His will, and approve the things that are excellent, being instructed out of the law, and are confident that you yourself are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of babes, having the form of knowledge and truth in the law. You therefore who teach another, do you not teach yourself? You who preach that a man should not steal, do you steal? You who say do not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who make your boast in the law, do you dishonor God through breaking the law? For the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you, as it is written. For circumcision is indeed profitable if you keep the law. But if you are a breaker of the law, your circumcision has become uncircumcision. Therefore, if an uncircumcised man keeps the righteous requirements of the law, will not his uncircumcision be counted as circumcision? And will not the physically uncircumcised, if he fulfills the law, judge you, who, even with your written code and circumcision, are a transgressor of the law? For he is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is circumcision that which is outward in the flesh. But he is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is that of the heart, in the spirit, not in the letter, whose praise is not from men, but from God. Now, the word law, I think I had a question. I may have counted it wrong, but I had it was there 21 times in these 18 verses. Now, that's a lot. So you know that this is talking about law. Now, is Paul referring to the law of Moses or to some other law?
I think he's referring to all law that God has given.
What? Well, let's think about it here. And let's look what he has to say. Now, here's the King James translation. For as many as you who have sinned without law shall also perish without law. And as many as have sinned in the law shall be judged by the law. The New King James is almost identical. Many as have sinned without law perish without law. And then those who have sinned in the law will be judged by the law. What two groups of people is he talking about? Huh? Jews and Gentiles. Who are the Gentiles in this verse, and who are the Jews? The Gentiles are those who he says are without law. Now this is pretty important that you get this, because there's a lot of thought out in the world that we're not under any law. As a matter of fact, Romans chapter 6, and I can't remember the verse, about 16 or 17, talks about you're not under law, but under grace. Well, what does that mean? That we're not under any laws anymore. Some have concluded that. So let's try to see. And he says here, as many have sinned without law. Now, in the English Standard Version, the definite article, the law, is in both the first part of the verse and the last part of the verse. For all who have sinned without the law instead of without law will also perish without the law. So also in the American Standard, it's the law. In the New English Translation, all who have sinned apart from the law, with a footnote. And here's what they have in the footnote in the New English Translation. This is the first occurrence of law, which is nomos in the Greek, in Romans. This is the first time that the word law occurs in Romans, and it is all through Romans about law. Exactly what Paul means by the term has been subject of much scholarly debate. According to J. Fitzmyer, there are at least 4 different senses, and I don't know that I agree with all this. I haven't looked at it that closely, but I'm just making the point that there is a lot of discussion about this. Is it figurative as a principle, generic meaning a law, as a reference to Old Testament or some part of the Old Testament, and as a reference to the Mosaic Law, and the last usage constitutes the majority of Paul's references. Most often it is about the Mosaic Law. Now, looking at it again, for as many have sinned without law, the definite article "the" is not in the Greek text, in the first or the last part of the verse. So why does the King James and the New King James add, and I've looked at the text in the Greek and try to understand it, and I'm by no means a student of Greek. I just read and I try to understand as much as I can, and I may not even be right on this. But the article "the" is not in the Greek text, either in the first part of or the last part of the verse. So my question was, why in the King James and the New King James do they add the article "the" in the last part, those who have sinned in the law? Why do they not put the article "the" in the first part, like English Standard does, the American Standard, and most all other translations? Why did they not put the article in front of the word "law" like they did in the last part of the verse? Now, like I said, I'm not a Greek scholar, but I'll just show you how easy it is to try to get some understanding. If you look, just Google, say, where we are, Romans chapter 4, verse 12, and Romans 4:12 and Greek, then you more likely will get the Bible Hub. And here you see on the right, the English, for, and you have to kind of see how the word flow goes, for as many as have sinned without law, and you will see in brackets the word "the." The word "the" is not in the text. What's in the text is this word nomos. Nomos is law. A negates that, so it's without law. But now, here's verse 13, where the article is in the text. For not the hearers of the law are justified, but the doers of the law. But you see the word "the" it's not in brackets. The Greek word "oi" is there. So you see it not in Romans 4:12. And so my question is, why did the King James put it in the last part of the law, the last part of the verse, but not the first? Now, let's think about this. All who have sinned without the law will also perish without the law. That's the better translation. But now, let's think of it like this. Since sin is transgression of the law, how can someone sin without the law? And by the way, in 1 John 3, verse 4, the article's not there either, and that's why you'll have in the most translations, for sin is what? Lawlessness. Sin is not transgression of the law of Moses, is not what he's talking about there. Sin is lawlessness. Sin is transgression of any law. When we sin today, what are we transgressing? Law of Moses? Law of Christ. Are we under law? Are we under the law of Christ? Yes. Give me a verse. We are under the law of Christ. Somebody look up Galatians chapter 6, verse 2. Galatians chapter 6, verse 2. And what does it say? And there are so many, and I listened to one particular guy talk about we're not under law, and trying to explain what this verse, Galatians 6, verse 2 means. It says, since the Bible doesn't define what the law of Christ is, it just means to love. And what if you love God, what do? Keep His commandments. So, it's kind of trying to dance around the fact that we have to keep commandments. But what does Galatians 6, verse 2 say? Anybody? Fulfill what? The law of Christ. Bear you one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. If you look at Romans chapter 8, verse 2, he talks about we are under the spirit of the law of Christ. How does that say? Romans 8, verse 2, I can't remember how it is, but it's not coming to mind right now. But at any rate, now here's a point I really want you to look at. Turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 9, and I don't have it on the screen, but turn over here to 1 Corinthians chapter 9 about this subject of law. Now, in 1 Corinthians 9, Paul is talking about the fact that he has made himself a servant to all. To the Jews, I became a Jew, Greek, I became a Greek. This is what I'm doing. I'm becoming all things to all men that I might by all means save some. Now, notice how it begins, 1 Corinthians 9, verse 19. For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win the more. And to the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those who are without law, as without law, not being without law toward God, but under law toward Christ, that I might win those who are without law. So he's again talking about the Jews and the Greek. The Jews were under the law, and he says, I also have become all things to those who are without law. And the same situation here is in the Greek. The article's not there in front of the word law. But let's think of it a little further. And how can someone sin without law? Is it possible to sin without law? No. You cannot. What does Romans 4:15 say? Just a couple of pages over in your text. What does Romans 4:15 say? Where there is no law, there is no transgression. So with that in mind, does this passage here in the verse 12, for as many as have sinned without law will also perish without law, does that mean that the Gentiles had no law? But he says they are without law. Okay? So if that doesn't mean they are without any law, and it doesn't mean that they're without any law, why would you not put the word thee has to be in there? Because they are without the law. They are without the law of Moses. Todd?
Part of that, anamus, is an adverb of a noun. I think that's part of what's throwing us off a little bit in our translations. And on the presence or absence, verse 13, in the Greek text, you got two different textual traditions. King James is resting on the Textus Receptus.
Yeah.
It has the article there in verse 13. The Nestle Allen text, which is based on the older Alexandrian and a couple of those, Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, it does not have it there. So the question becomes,
Right.
with the scribes that were handling that, did the later scribes add that article in there to try to clear this up? Or was it left out from those old manuscripts? That's a whole long
Right.
discussion, but that's part of
Well, I noticed in looking at the Bible Hub, they actually use a more modern Greek text, and I can't remember what it is. But
Seems to me obvious that what he's saying is they were without the old law.
yes,
They were strangers from the covenants of promise, like he says in Ephesians
right.
2. That's all it's saying.
That's why the ESV is more correct here, because all who have sinned without the law of Moses. It's not saying those who have sinned without any law, because where there is no law, there is no transgression. So then the conclusion that we have to make is that the Gentiles were under law. Look at it like this. Now remember that this section in Romans is discussing the need for the gospel. And the reason why there's a need for the gospel, because those who have violated the law, they're subject to the wrath of God. Now, the Jews and Gentiles have both sinned. Have we already seen that? You see the Gentile world and all the sins they were in. He talks about the Jews. Therefore, you're inexcusable, O man, whoever you are, who judge others. You're doing the same things. They've sinned. Jews have sinned. Gentiles have sinned. Sin is lawlessness. Sin is transgression of law. It's transgression of any law of God. Therefore, both Jews and Gentiles were under law. You can't say that the Gentiles were not under law. They were under, it's a question. Jews were under Mosaic law prior to Pentecost. Now remember, this is prior to Pentecost. But what law were Gentiles under prior to Pentecost? And George has answered that. What law did the Gentiles not have? They didn't have the law of Moses. What law were they under? The same law that people were under from Adam and Eve to Mount Sinai, which is, I think, about 2,500 years. So during those years, people were under law. That's like if Cain killed Abel, was that a violation of law? Well, certainly. During the time of Noah, when the world became so wicked, were they violating God's law? Yes, they were violating God's law. You look at all the times with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob when people were transgressing God's law or were living, they were under a law because they were violating what you've mentioned, George, patriarchal law. But now, before I get to that, anybody else have a question or comment?
So I looked at that adverb there, and perhaps the best way to put it would be lawlessly. BDAG, which is the kind of standard lexicon on this, most up to date, has without participation in an organized legal system. Then it go on to point out that the discussion that Paul has on this makes it clear which organized legal system he's referring to.
Right.
Just as George said, it is definitely the law of Moses that's in view in most of this here. But the fact that they didn't have an organized legal system, as in a written code of law, seems to be the distinction that's made here between two.
Yeah, it has to be the law of Moses, just by looking at it, by thinking it through. Because those who sinned without law can't mean they sinned without any law, so it has to mean that they sinned without the law of Moses. But that's important because some conclude that, well, there's possibility of not being under any law. We're all under law. We're under the law of Christ. And no matter how some might say, well, and when we get to Romans chapter 6, where it says you're not under law but under grace, we need to understand that in the context. That doesn't mean that we are free to be disobedient. And that's how he immediately jumps to that next comment in Romans 6. What a ghastly thought, as he would say in Romans 6, verse 1, or not at all. But at any rate, going on here, when the Gentiles who do not have the law of Moses, by nature do the things in the law, these, although not having the law, are a law to themselves. They by nature do the things in the law. Now, what was it that was said back in chapter 1 about these people who suppress the truth? The invisible things, the invisible attributes of Him from the creation of the world are what? Clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. People have known from the beginning of time there are certain things that are right, there are certain things that are wrong. Don't you think that's what this is teaching? People will say, well, what about this person over here that's never obeyed the gospel? They know. That's the difference between us and animals. Jerry?
There's never been a period of time since Genesis 1 that there has not been law. God has never condemned anyone except for breaking His law. Cain was put out because he broke the law that God gave him and able to live by. The world was destroyed by the flood because everybody except Noah and his family broke the law that God had provided for them.
Right.
And after God was through dealing through the leaders of families, He instituted the law of Moses and selected the children of Israel to be His chosen people. He did not ignore the rest of the people in the world at that time. They were not under the Mosaic law, but they were still under the law that God had given all of mankind up to that time. Then He instituted the law of Moses as a means to prepare the world for the law of Christ. At which time the law of Christ became the only law that the entire world was to live by. God has always been a just God in that He never held anyone accountable for what He did not tell them.
That's good, and certainly that's the point.
And we need to be mindful of the fact that God chose to give us a written word, but He did not choose to give us the details in many cases of how He dealt with the Gentiles during the time
Right.
that the Jews were His chosen people. But today we have the specifics of
And it might be good to define the word law, since we've talked about it here for the last several minutes. What does the word law mean? It's rules or regulations that govern people. Huh? Okay, it includes doctrine. So when we're talking about law of God, it's God's rules, God's regulations that are to govern people. And so when it gets to the Gentiles, they don't have the law of Moses, but by nature they do the things in the law. Although not having the law, they become a law to themselves. But look at it in its full context. The hearers of the law are just in the sight of God, are not just in the sight of God, but the doers of the law will be justified. Now, this is important for all of us. All of it's important to all of us, but when the Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do the things in the law, these, although not having the law, are a law to themselves. Now, notice this, who show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness between themselves, the thoughts either accusing or else excusing them. So this law of God that they have becomes written in their hearts. And he brings up this word conscience. Now, let's talk about that a little bit more. Conscience, is this a yes for me or a no for me? Is this good? Is this bad? Is this right or it wrong? I don't know what the G just kind of dropped over there by itself, but it didn't fit the screen like it did on mine at home. But at any rate, let's look at the conscience. The conscience receives information. We all have a conscience. Moral judgment is based on that information. You decide what is wrong, right or wrong, based on the information that your conscience receives. It gives you a possible course of action. Once you have this information and you decide, based on this information, what's right or wrong, or this information has told you what's right, is right or wrong, then you have a possible course of action. You can either choose this or that based on this information. The conscience will urge you to act, or it will urge you to not, to restrain. It will let you do things, or it will not let you do things. But it's all based on the information. Then after you make a decision, if you act in harmony with your conscience, you will be approved. If you do not act in harmony with your information, your conscience will condemn you. But now all this has to be understood about that word information. That's the main thing about it. What you put into your mind, if it's from the Word of God, your conscience will be all right. But if you let what you think, what you feel, what somebody else tells you, and that is the thing that directs your conscience, you could go anywhere. And so he says, their conscience either accusing or excusing them. That's what it's all about. And this information that they have gathered has been, as he talks about, from the nature of things. You know some things. Now, who will be justified in the sight of God? He says, the doers of the law. Now remember, there's so much out there in the world today that it has nothing to do with your obedience. It's all by the grace of God. You're saved by faith alone, through grace alone. But Paul, in the very outset of Romans, is talking all about these things about law and says those who are going to be justified who are doers of the law. It depends on which law, the law which they are under. If you are a Gentile under, as George mentioned, patriarchal law, then you will be justified based on what you did with the patriarchal law. If you're a Jew, you're going to be justified based on what you did with the Jewish law, the Mosaic law. If you are living since Pentecost, as we all are, we will be justified based on what we have done with the law of Christ. Galatians 6, verse 2. There is the law of Christ. So, another question, what did the conscience of the Gentiles do for them? It bore witness, also bearing witness between themselves, their thoughts accusing or excusing them. That's what it did for them. It's what it does for us today. It either accuses or excuses us. And you can have a guilty conscience when you do not obey the law that you're under. If you disobey the law of Christ, you're going to have a guilty conscience. You can sear it, 1 Timothy 4, verse 2, I believe, like a hot iron. What part of man will God judge, and by whom? He will, now notice this, God will judge the secrets of men. Your secrets, my secrets. What I do when nobody else sees me, that's what God's going to judge. That's a scary thought, isn't it? We think maybe we're okay, like the Jews, they thought they could do whatever because they were in a covenant relationship. Nobody could pass judgment on them. We may think if we do things in secret, it's not hurting anybody. And God knows all about it. And he says the day when God will judge the secrets of men by Christ, according to my gospel. So here's some things about the judgment of God, and these are sobering thoughts. Now listen carefully to what all the things, we summarize here how he's described the judgment of God. It's according to truth, not like some court today that may get it all wrong. It is the fact that no one is going to escape the judgment. He's made that clear, Jew and Gentile alike. It is called the day of wrath. It will be a righteous judgment. Even though wrath is involved, it will be righteous. It will be rendered according to one's deeds, whatever you've done. Some will receive eternal life, others will receive wrath. It will be without respect of persons, no partiality. It will be according to the law that one was under. We just mentioned, if you're under the law of Moses, you'll be judged based on that law. Under the law of Christ, you'll be judged by that law. That is, if you lived under the law of Moses prior to Pentecost. God will judge the secrets of men, and the judgment will be by Jesus Christ. Now, will those who live before the gospel was preached, will they be judged by the gospel? Now, he makes this statement, he will judge the secrets of men by Jesus Christ according to my gospel. Those who lived under patriarchy, those who lived under the law of Moses prior to Pentecost, they're not going to be judged by the gospel. That's not what that means. I mean, how could anybody who lived back in the day of Moses have known that he had to be baptized? Well, you weren't baptized, Moses. You weren't. He's not under that law. He's not under the law of Christ. So, what this means, what Paul is saying here, the gospel, when Paul says my gospel, the gospel which was preached included the truth about a day of judgment. According to my gospel, God's going to have a judgment day that's in harmony with the gospel that I preach. That's what I preach about. But it does not mean those who lived before the gospel came into effect that they're going to be judged by whatever, what day of the week we worship, how we worship, whether we take of the Lord's Supper. They're not be judged by that, obviously. I mean, that's obvious. So that's not what that means. They're going to be judged the same way we are. But there will be a fair judgment if they obeyed what God told them to do under whichever law. That's how they're going to receive the blessing. Well, it's kind of a whirlwind class here, and I hope it wasn't too much. But